Well, good morning. Really full lunch, so thanks for sticking around. I'm going to talk a little bit about two bottom-up approaches, the Open Water Seas and Conflict Avoidance Agreement and the work by the Arctic Waterways Safety Committee as ways that some of these things have come into being. So I acknowledge my co-authors on this, Jessica Lefebvre, and then Willie Goodwin, the chair of the Waterways Safety Committee, and Harry Brower, chair of the Alaska Eskimo Whaling Commission. I'm going to start a little bit, just so, prelude into this, if you like, on the way I think about this. I come from a resilience background, and so when I'm thinking about this sort of joint system of the ecology and social, I'm thinking about how do we maintain the relationships in this system in the face of change, which opens up the question, what are the relationships we're trying to maintain, and what is the changes that we're trying to manage for? And so when I think about relationships, from a subsistence perspective, I was fortunate to spend some time with Harry at his camp up north of Barrow, and this is one way to think of that relationship. Hunters who've been doing this for millennia, hunting bowhead whales as they come along the spring leads out here 6 miles on the sea ice edge. But it's important to remember that subsistence isn't just this taking of whales. It also includes a myriad of cultural aspects, obviously of culture, things like drumming, all sorts of other activities, crafts within these communities. It also includes a hefty dose of economics these days, and Jim Magdans, who's in here, and colleagues have done some wonderful work looking at that mixed economies and the balance between traditional subsistence practices and the cash economy and how they weave seamlessly together. And so this idea of a relationship that we're trying to manage around, it involves all these different aspects within these communities. And then change. Change we may be thinking about from a perspective of climate change, and what does climate do to these subsistence hunting communities. These are two pictures I took on St. Lawrence Island at Gamble a year apart. 2013 was regarded as a disaster year for walrus hunting. The community was not able to get the walrus it needed for its food security, and announced a disaster for that area. So here, the sea ice conditions as a result of climate change have a profound implication to food security. And then new visitors to the area, offshore oil and gas. And more commonly discussed these days, large ship traffic coming through the Northern Sea Route of the Northwest Passage. All these changes bring a lot of different things. The chronic and acute noise from vessels or from seismic testing, physical disturbance, bring new visitors like the Crystal Cruises. Community structure may change, they may bring pollution, but also bring opportunities, and that idea that there's good and bad in these things, and all of these things have an impact on food and economic security. And so how do we sort of work to manage those things? So with that introduction, we can come to governance. And this is the set of the regulatory processes, mechanisms, and organizations through which political actors influence environmental actions and outcomes. This is that implementation we're talking about in this session. From a national or international level, there's a lot of conversation happened about this, and some great documents, PAIM, which Lawson was involved in, or even the concept paper for the ecosystem approach to management. But thinking about those political actors again, it's not just the government, it's not just these higher level actors, it's also the actions that people like communities, businesses, NGOs, all of these people have a role in governance. And for this presentation, I'll be particularly focusing on the role of communities. So starting with the Open Water Conflict Avoidance Agreement, I do apologize for the formatting on this. I think Mac PC haunts us again. The idea here from the Conflict Avoidance Agreement was oil and gas was moving up into the Chukchi Sea, into the Beaufort Sea, and how does the local hunters have a voice in ensuring that their food security is preserved? This has been going on for several decades. And the idea that individual hunters, if they spoke alone, their voices would get lost in the governance deliberations. The voices are strongest when all villages speak together. And it built on a history of the hunters speaking strongly together in relation to regulation of the whale harvest when the International Whaling Commission had looked to stop the whale harvest through perceptions on the number of whales out there. The hunters came together and worked cooperatively to establish what the whale population was and then worked to advocate for their own hunt. So now, during the annual conflict avoidance agreement meetings, 11 villages each send 3 representatives to meet in Barrow with representatives of the oil and gas industry. Those meetings are facilitated by the commissioners, staff, and the legal counsel. At the annual meeting, the offshore oil and gas plans are presented, and then representatives from each village caucus and decide what are the concerns they have and how do you mitigate those concerns. So again, this is working with industry, agencies are in the room. How do we resolve the problems that we're perceiving for the coming season? All of those measures are set out in the conflict avoidance agreement, which covers all the planned activities from oil and gas, and those measures that are designed to protect subsistence. The AWSC chairman, all villages, and the offshore operators then sign the CAA, providing a predictable environment for all operators, all parties. And I really want to emphasize that piece, this idea of having a process where people recognize a problem, they come together, they resolve it, they sign off on that agreement. This is the way we'll act to avoid that conflict. It means that oil and gas can go into that area, they can operate within some known parameters and know they're not going to cause conflict. It means the hunters can go out and do their hunting and knowing they're not going to be disturbed by oil and gas activities during that time. It's a lot of tension, there's a lot of challenging times. I know Jim and you've seen in a lot of these meetings, but at the end of the day it's become a very workable solution where you have 2 very different activities, seismic testing for oil and gas, traditional hunting for bowhead whales, and it's come together and worked fairly well. The key mitigation measures that get worked around, number 1 is the communication centers that were set up by oil and gas industry in each of the key villages. Time area closures, those are able to mitigate the seismic and drilling interference with the hunting. Some restrictions on vessel movements to protect the marine mammals, and restrictions on discharges, which avoids pollution and so damage to the quality of the food. So that was the conflict avoidance agreement, and over the sort of 3 decades that came together, it provided a model of basically hunters working with industry to resolve a problem. And it was really what informed the Arctic Waterways Safety Committee, which came about to work on the issues associated with shipping. It's a fundamentally different process, but that idea of working together to solve a collective problem is really what drove this process as well. Whereas the conflict avoidance agreement set new ground, the idea of a safety committee is not new. There's 130 or 140 of these in the United States. Puget Sound is a good example where all the operators on the waterways of Puget Sound came together, they set up their own committee and said, how do we avoid conflict amongst each other? How do we avoid safety issues on the water? How do we avoid impacts to wildlife or the macaw in that area? And so this is the same as for the Arctic, where again we're going to come together and resolve issues around vessel traffic. For me, this started in about 2006 when I was working with the Eskimo Walrus Commission, and commissioners were coming and starting to talk about seeing these new vessels, whether they were research, whether they were just transiting west of Gamble in Russian waters. People were starting to get concerned about new vessels in the area. The same was going on with the Whaling Commission. And so a group of us, including Pew Charitable Trust, Carolina from ICC was involved in these visits to Diomede, Wales, Gamble, Subunga, and really try to document what people were worried about in relation to these vessels. This led to the formation of the Arctic Marine Mammal Coalition. It was all the 5 marine mammal co-management bodies decided to come together and work cooperatively on resolving shipping issues. It was a nice situation because when they came together, they sat down, we had Coast Guard came in, Lawson Brigham was involved in some of these early discussions, and some of the challenges or the problems that were perceived were just knowing what was going on out there. And so, or letting the ships know there's subsistence going on here. And so we had some early successes with annotations on the charts or information going into the coast pilot, and because there was the collective group of everybody speaking with a voice, it was very easy to get that information into the coast pilot, so now mariners had better awareness of what was going on the water. Once we got to that point, things became a little bit more difficult. We needed to have more people at the table to have decisions about what happened. And so the Coast Guard suggested at that point that we go this Waterways Safety Committee route, modeled on these other areas. And so in 2014, we had our first meeting to set up the Waterways Safety Committee, and had several meetings since then, working to bring different partners in. So we have people like Tech Kaminka, who do the shipping into Red Dog. We have the tug and barge operators that do village supply, oil and gas operators. So it's trying to get everybody using the waterways coming into a room to resolve common problems. If anyone's interested in looking more into this, the Arctic Waterways Safety Committee is arcticwaterways.org, and there's quite a bit of information on it online. Here's the setup for the committee. Everybody came together. There's a set of officers at the top, and then basically 3 groups of waterway users. We have the subsistence hunters, representatives of subsistence hunters, representatives of industry, and then other groups like the marine pilots, landowners in the region, coming together. If there was a vote, that would be the 15 parties that would make up the vote. A variety of subcommittees to work on specific issues, and a bunch of ex officio observers. The idea of a committee like this, it comes up with that best practices for operating on the waterways, and then the Coast Guard would endorse it. It's not a regulatory thing, it's a best practice that's come about through consensus. So this is the area that the committee covers. It's basically everything from the Queric region, the political region, encompassing St. Lawrence Island North. And for those areas, these best practices have a term of art called a standard of care. And so I said these are things that are by consensus, they're not regulatory. And so these are procedures and practices beyond regulatory requirements that experienced and prudent professional mariners follow to ensure safe, secure, efficient, and environmentally responsible maritime operations. So these are things that people who use the waterways are helping come up with. This is not something that's new and imposed. It's like, how do we work best on the waterways? These are good marine practices that are developed and published to provide a guide for maritime professionals to consider and incorporate into their decision-making processes. So if you imagine new visitors coming up to the Arctic, they now have a resource to go to see how the locals deal with conflict or deal with safety issues on the waterways. And then finally, mariners should be mindful if they are not involved in a maritime incident, when they're not following these best practices, then that opens them up to some ideas of negligence. And so it's not a regulatory thing, but there are repercussions potentially if people don't follow these and then get into trouble. The standards of care that are being worked on over the last year, we've been working on conflict associated with research vessels coming close to communities. Often the research vessels, are targeting areas of biological productivity, which is where hunters are going as well. It's been an interesting process. A lot of people in this room have been involved in it. Again, a lot of the issues that were coming up of a conflict were just people not having talked to each other before. There was a lot of vessels out there that people didn't know. And even this year, which is the second year of this process, I've heard so much good news from people being really happy that they just know more about what's going on. Maritime tourism is an issue that's spinning up as another standard of care. What's the appropriate actions around communities? If a vessel comes like the Crystal Serenity and wants to go to a community, what's the best mode of places to anchor, and how much notice does a community need to be prepared to have that vessel on its doorstep? Activities proximal to marine mammals. Obviously we have these areas of huge aggregation. Bowhead whales is number one, with 17,000 whales going north and then south through Bering Strait each year. How do we avoid vessels and those whales having impacts? And then the connections with the maritime insurance industry and how that should be played out within a best practice. Several people will have heard of the IMO's Polar Code. We're hoping that the best practices set out in this document can inform the Polar Code through a component called voyage planning, When any vessel is planning to come through the Arctic, they will need to do voyage planning, and so this will be one of the resources that can inform those activities. How do you operate around subsistence communities during times of the year when there's sensitivities? Yeah, I should have gone with a PDF here. So just a couple of conclusions. I think it's important to consider both of these processes are regarded as reasonably successful, not that there's no conflict, but the conflict's getting worked out through time. And a lot of the buy-in from the communities and the different stakeholders is that they've been a part of this from the day one. Since this came up as an idea, they've been a part of the development of the bylaws, for example, so everybody's on the same page. There are clear goals and objectives for reaching consensus in both of these processes. There's recognized boundaries among the health of the physical environment, wildlife, and human communities. They embrace the significant length of time required to engage in a meaningful process. The CAA was 30 years in development, and for the Waterways Safety Committee, that's been working for 5 years now to start developing those processes. The value for informal and dynamic processes of problem solving. We don't have to do everything through regulation. We can sit down in a room as a group and we can come up with best practices more informally than that, which we can all agree on and abide by. Oops. And this bottom one here was to be creative on funding, and it's a point that I'd like to have as a take-home on here. There's a lot of money out there for some big overarching agreements, but both of these processes have been extensively funded through foundation, philanthropic support. And it's an interesting balance between where funding comes for these large-scale, holistic approaches to management. And really, the question I would ask is that the appropriate way to go with philanthropic foundations bearing the brunt of the local participation in these processes? With that, I'll take any questions, recognizing that lunch is between